Okay, so I wanted to record a little bit, just to kind of go over some concepts to help you, and you're under no obligation to have to listen to this. I'm going to suggest it, maybe to kind of make sure that you're doing okay on your Federalist discussion board, and because it was kind of rushed trying to get all this in. But I mean, you should have enough information based on where we stopped that you should be fine. But this is just for those who are motivated to learn a little bit more. I believe most of the classes, I think I had, was it 2B? We kind of didn't quite get this far. You have this notion about this new society. You can read most of this. Most of this is pretty self-explanatory. I do want to mention kind of, shout out to the notion of Republican motherhood. As being something that kind of takes the place of the right to vote for many women. And this ultimately leads to women being very involved in social causes and that kind of thing, as well as create some of the arguments against women's suffrage as we move into the 20th century, that women express their votes through their husbands and their fathers and their brothers and that kind of thing, and that women have a role to play. So that's kind of where that argument comes from. I think with 2B we stopped here with expansion. Again, you can read most of this. Big thing, note how young the population was. That's very important. We have lots of enthusiasm moving into the 1800s, and lots of movement west, with cities still being centers of culture and kind of having the national awareness, but your rural focus continuing to be centered on local concerns. The yeoman farmer is going to be kind of the poster child for America for a long, long time. We'll be talking about yeoman farmers, these kind of independent family farms. They're semi-subsistence. They make a little bit of extra so they can make a little bit of money, but they're not filthy rich, and that kind of thing. Native Americans, of course, are going to be largely ignored in this process. So I just kind of wanted to nod my head towards that because we don't dwell a whole lot on Native American claims. But there is history there. It's just largely unimportant for the kind of the Anglo-American version, I guess you could say. We have mentioned before about the end of the international slave trade. We talked about the Great Compromise and how that was kind of intended to be something that was part of the slow death of slavery, and yet that slow death doesn't happen, and that in part because of the cotton gin and the textile industry. The last part that I know I didn't cover in any of the classes are these important concepts, and I wanted to touch on them as we're getting ready to move into the Federalist 10. The 1780s, you have this notion of this kind of republicanism in the sense that you have these virtuous, informed citizens. And it helps if these are citizens that own property, and that they will elect representatives. And these representatives will then go take their message, and that the centralized government will be able to balance out the interests that we see. They will be able to come up with a way to prevent the rural areas and the cities from being at each other's throats, and the different regions from being at each other's throats. And it's kind of part of this promise is that people have opportunity, and there is lots of opportunity in the 1800s, in part because there's so much land available. There's so much expansion. You also have kind of some kind of an early industrial revolution happening in the early 1800s, and that kind of helps some. And we've kind of talked about individualism. Big thing here is that the republicanism with the states versus the nation, the federalism, that's going to take another 70 years for people to work out. This is a process, guys. It's not all solved just because we create the Constitution. The Constitution helps, but again, you're going to have lots of other things going on. And so it's a dance, and it continues to be a dance. We continue to try to figure out which is more important, the federal government or the state government, and what matters more, local representation or national representation, and how do we weigh the public good against our local interests. Some of our local interests right now would have to do with issues about immigration And those issues may not be as pressing in other states. Other states are going to be more concerned about the pipeline, for instance. And who's going to make these decisions to balance these out? And so in some ways, this is very removed from us, and then in other ways, it's absolutely the world in which we live in. The other thing I want to point out is you have a French Revolution happening that really kind of really gets out of hand. It starts a little bit before 1789. You start to have lots of, the French get kind of messed up with having helped the United States, and we owe them money, and we're not able to pay them back, and all this kind of stuff. And then King Louis kind of starts to have problems about 1789. I think by 1791, he loses his head, and Marie Antoinette's like a year later. And you have France really being engulfed in radicalism and in radical interpretations that allow people to have direct say, that allow groups and different factions to come into control. And this is one of the things that the Constitution prevents. Our Constitution doesn't allow these factions to kind of take hold. Now, one can argue that the United States has always been more conservative than France, that the very men that were in charge of creating our Constitution were far more conservative than those who were in charge of the French Revolution. And that can certainly is an application of that. But the French Revolution was by far very different, and it creates a lot of problems. So you really have this perfect example of what can go wrong in a revolution with the French. And in fact, Alexis de Tocqueville, which we'll talk about at some point this year, I don't know if we'll do it when we get to the 1830s. He talks a lot about kind of what makes America different. How are Americans better? How have they figured this system out? And it's because the Constitution really is an exceptional document. So that being said, I wanted to talk about something that I didn't get a chance to do, and some of you may have seen this on the board in class. This kind of comes from one of the document exercises, and obviously I'm not going to make us do this, and I'm going to try to keep this relatively short. But I do want to point out that you've got several groups that are at play during this constitutional crisis. You've got these Southern planters, and these Southern planters are, of course, very, they have wealthy, they're very wealthy, but their wealth is tied to their slaves, and basically you have a lot of concerns with slaves running away, with slave revolt, but you're also concerned about how to manage your business now that the United States is no longer a part of Great Britain. Are banks going to want to do that with you? And are you going to be okay with, with being able to accept, payment in kind? Payment in kind has to do with farmers basically paying their debts with cows, corn, or tobacco. And bankers don't want to do that, but you need to borrow money in order to buy more slaves and land, but the bankers don't want to loan money because they're afraid of payment in kind. So you've got lots of concerns like that. And you're also concerned about poor farmers and men who don't own slaves. And are they really the ones that need to be driving policy? Is that what was meant by equality? So, and you were paid in government bonds, right? These, the Continental Congress made these Continental dollars, and they're supposed to be backed by something. So eventually, you're going to have to, you're hoping you can reclaim some of this, but because right now nobody's accepting them because nobody knows what the federal government's going to be able to do. So you're going to have some real concerns about how you make your money, how to keep your assets fluid, and about the influence of ordinary people that don't own property the way you do. And you're concerned about these bonds and about the ability of the government to pay them back. If you're just your basic farmer, right, you are struggling with debt, you're struggling with your farm, you're struggling with taxes, you have these kinds of things like these bonds, these Continental dollars that you were paid for fighting. But you also want to rely on payment in kind. You want to be able to pay your taxes with cows or corn or wheat or whatever. And so you're feeling very frustrated. And this is kind of the same group of people that would have marched with Daniel Shays. And you feel that it's justified to reach out and stand up for yourselves, because didn't you fight a revolution in order to protect yourself from foreclosure, to protect your opportunity, to create equality so that bankers and planters don't have a special advantage over you? And yet that certainly seems to be kind of what's happening here, is that these men are starting to gain access to government in a way that you cannot, and government's passing laws that are bad for you. Again, very similar to what was happening with the American Revolution. So you're going to want a federal government that's going to negotiate on your behalf, that's going to step in and listen to your concerns, because you're struggling to make ends meet. Obviously, enslaved African Americans don't own anything. They are the workforce for the South. You work very hard. The Constitutional Convention, the Declaration of Independence, had made some big promises about slavery. But now the question is, what do we do about the slave trade? Do we want to continue to allow slaves? Do we count slaves as population? And, will it eventually be outlawed? What are we going to do with it? So I encourage you to kind of think in terms of that, that what are the hopes and the promises that you might have because these conversations are being had. And even if you were to gain freedom, what would happen? Would you be any better off, really? Because you would have trouble getting land, and look at the trouble that the poor farmers are having. If you're a banker or a merchant, you have very different concerns. You're very upset about debtors paying you with product, with corn, with cows, with wheat, whatever, and you want to be sure you're getting paid back $100, but you don't want these government bonds, right? So this is one of the real concerns. Now, a lot of these bankers and merchants do start buying up government bonds from people at pennies on the dollar, and so you're hoping to have these bonds paid back by the federal government, and so that's what that would be a real positive for you, even though you've been very frustrated with the lack of government, the lack of control that's going on. And if you're just an ordinary worker in this system, what you're looking at, where's my worker thing? Here it is. You're really struggling. You're hoping that you're going to be able to make it. You have a small shop. The war's ended. You're struggling with the new flood of products to kind of sell what you're making. And so this is one of the real problems, right? And people are, trying to collect debts from you, but they don't want to collect debts in shoes. You're having trouble getting paid from people. And so you have this issue about the money. You have these government bonds. Doesn't the government need to pay you back? Don't these need to be guaranteed? You could go to a banker and sell your bonds for less value than they're worth, but what's going to happen if Congress decides to repay them? And so you're very concerned about paying high taxes because now taxes are going up because the states are trying to raise money. So what's going to happen? Who's going to be writing a constitution, essentially? So these are the groups that are going to be very concerned in this whole process. And if you look at the people who wrote the Constitution, many of these people essentially had interests that were with lands or with government bonds. And you can kind of look through these different people. And many of these names won't be familiar to you. A few of them might be. But you will notice one trend. A lot of these men are very wealthy. A lot of these men own property. A lot of these men have gambled, invested, if you will, in bonds, and have some connections with merchants and banks. So this is kind of the men that are important to the Constitution. And so this is one of the things that I think is important to realize, is that these guys were not your ordinary farmers and workers. These were wealthy individuals. Some of them, they weren't all necessarily planters. Some of them were merchants and bankers. Some of them were just extremely prosperous farmers. But they were definitely men of property and wealth. And I think that's something that is worth kind of noting as we consider how some of this stuff worked out. So if you go to this notion about, except where's my document here? If you go to this notion about who would have 1 in the Constitution. If you look at some of these ideas about slavery being legal, you can go to our Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, which is essentially going to talk about being able to control slavery. Essentially, you can see here Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1. So that's going to be right here. It looks like we have, let's say that they can't prohibit an importation of people, and so they have these kind of controls on it. You also see that if you go to should Northerners be forced to turn over runaway slaves, if you go to Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, there's provisions for that. If you go to Article 1, Section 10, you can see kind of the reaction about this idea of about paying back with payment in kind and that kind of thing. And I think I'm looking at the wrong thing, actually, or maybe not. I don't know. It looks like maybe I'm in the right thing. It's hard to say. Anyways, but what I can tell you is that if you go look at the actual Constitution itself, you can see where some of these things that would have been concerns for your small farmer, for your worker, those are not necessarily listened to. And yet, what we know is that these guys, that these wealthy farmers, these wealthy planters, do create a system that does tend to function. And what we'll see throughout history is how sometimes these ordinary people manage to gain some relevance. We'll talk when we get to the 1830s about kind of how the common man supported Andrew Jackson. So I wanted to just kind of point this out to make sure you knew. Like I said, you might take a chance. I'll share the PDF with you so that if you really want to kind of dig through, because I feel like I'm looking at the wrong thing. And I'm trying to do this in a rush, and so anyways, I'm not doing this very efficiently. But you can look at this yourself and kind of see who would really kind of won in the Constitution. And I can tell you it's going to be your bankers, your merchants, your southern planters. They're the ones who have the advantages, and they're the ones who are represented in the makeup of those who are at the Constitutional Convention. Now, that sounds like a critique, and I guess it is a little bit, except that it does work. The Constitution does work, and ultimately, it's created a great deal of stability. Alexander Hamilton believed that if you got the wealthy individuals to support the country, it would be successful. And I think that that is something that we can see. Now, what that means for today, how do we apply that when we think about republicanism and considering the public good? At what point do these wealthy individuals have an obligation to respond to concerns of ordinary people? Obviously, if they don't respond to some of it, what they're risking is kind of hurting the overall economy. So there is an argument to be made that they do need to be sensitive in some ways. And so just kind of stick that in the back of your head as you're thinking about the Federalist 10. Stick it in the back of your head, too, as we move through U.S. history. And we will see these times where, local concerns outweigh, where individual concerns outweigh, and these ordinary people kind of get control of things, and then you're going to have these wealthy interests come back. And sometimes it's okay. Sometimes it actually is a good thing. Sometimes it's not a good thing. And so there's just this ebb and flow to the system. And so I just kind of wanted to share this with you. I don't know if it helped you at all, but it might help you think a little bit differently about Federalist 10 as you're trying to analyze these different situations. It might also give you some examples from kind of this constitutional period that might help you with that, in addition to Shays or in addition to the Virginia plan versus the New Jersey plan, and some of those kinds of concerns that we've talked about. And I'm under 20 minutes, which is a little bit long, but not too bad. So thank you.